Hey there. I'm Jessica Lauren Walton, and this is my interview corner. If there's a cool story in the security field or just something that I think is going to be valuable for my fellow security professionals, then I want to talk about it. To learn more about the work I do as a writer, you can go ahead and visit my blog at jessicawaltonwriter.com. Okay, so today's guest is Beth Bailey, a former intelligence analyst for the US Army and the co host of the Afghanistan Project podcast. Why am I talking about Afghanistan today? It admittedly deviates a bit from the usual topics that I cover. Well, what's happening in Afghanistan today, since the US withdrawal in 2021, is not only catastrophic for Afghans, but it is evolving into a national security threat for America as well. So, Beth and I are going to talk about the events that led up to the withdrawal, what went wrong, and what we should be fighting for today. So, thank you for tuning in. Let's go in there and start talking to Beth. Hey, Beth, thank you for joining me today.
Hey, Jessica, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, admittedly, I usually run interviews on topics about mental health and psychology in the security field. But more recently, I became interested in the ongoing situation in Afghanistan, its implications for our country's national security. And it's very unfortunate, both for our Afghan allies and the American people, that a lot of important events that are now taking place in Afghanistan are being kind of swept under the rug in mainstream media for political reasons. So I appreciate you taking the time to educate me and others tuning in about the conflict in Afghanistan and for the work you do in keeping this issue in the public eye through your own platform.
Oh, well, I am just glad to talk about it. You're right. Nobody really wants to talk about it. It's messy, it's difficult, it's really sad. So I'm
Yeah.
glad to have the opportunity, and it's affected mental health. So really, this isn't too far from what you cover on a regular basis. In my podcast, the Afghanistan Project podcast, a lot of what we cover is moral injury for people who have
Mm,
participated in Afghanistan, whether as volunteers or in the military. And I mean, it has a last and in the intelligence field, it has had a lasting impact on people who
yeah.
um, care about it deeply and feel very badly about what has happened there.
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't been to Afghanistan. I haven't served in the US military, but I have a lot of friends and colleagues who are veterans. And, I remember very well the impact on mental health and moral injury, following the withdrawal in 2021. And I certainly try to be sensitive to that.
Yeah. Oh, it's very ongoing. It's horrifying.
Yeah.
I shouldn't laugh at all, but sometimes that's the only thing you can do to as you're wrapping your head around just the vastness of that pain. So I'm just glad to
Yeah.
get to talk about everything that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm very grateful for you sharing your experience and knowledge. So getting started, tell me a bit about your background, including what led you to establish the Afghanistan Project podcast.
So we'd have to go back to college, at the College of William and Mary. I did their DC program, ended up working at the House Oversight Committee right during when we were preparing to leave Iraq and getting ready to kind of start the surge. So this was about a year before the surge started in 2010. And
Mhm.
um, I was on the National Security Subcommittee. They wanted me constantly to be looking into different topics related to Iraq and Afghanistan. And I had no knowledge about any of that problem set. But I started getting into it and realizing, oh, well, I don't understand this. I don't understand that. And if I didn't understand something, I wanted to be able to understand it. I was expected to kind of brief the people that I was working for and be read up on these things. And so it started as just, okay, like, what do you have to know? And then it became, I just wanted to know everything. And at the same time, we were diving in my coursework to kind of fragile states and post-conflict state reconstruction, where we were not just focusing on Afghanistan, but also, former Yugoslavia, stuff all over the place, any kinds of conflict that had required international response, and how we could learn, apply those lessons to Afghanistan. And so I was just kind of getting it from all sides, and I loved it. And I came back to William and Mary as a senior. I did another semester in DC, and kind of learned more about counterinsurgency at that time. But I was also with the Department of Justice chasing Nazis who had come here under false pretenses.
Thank
So it was
you.
a
I
bit of a
appreciate that.
deviation, right? Right. It was it was an amazing, amazing opportunity, and horrifying,
Wow.
but I still I knew I couldn't let go of Afghanistan. And so the way that I managed that is I would do my internship, and then I decided I was going to write my honors thesis on the German failed application of counterinsurgency strategy in Serbia during World War II, because that's where this individual was stationed who was participating in genocide against the Jewish population in German occupied Serbia. And so I figured out a way to kind of bring things full circle and still keep learning about counterinsurgency and about Afghanistan. I became the weird Afghanistan girl when I came back to William and Mary as a senior. I was
Yeah.
one of maybe two seniors in the intro Arabic class, because you couldn't do Pashto or Dari. You had to start with Arabic. And so I was like, well, I might as well start here. I applied for every job I could find in Afghanistan. I got none of them. So like you, I have never been to Afghanistan. But I ended up getting a job at the National Ground Intelligence Center, doing intelligence analysis as a civilian. And
This was
it
part of the
really,
U.S. Army.
yeah, it's their Army's
Mhm.
intelligence organization. So
Okay.
like Marine Corps has MCIA, Army has NGIC. And, I went in just this freak who really cares about Afghanistan and is very strange and really is intrigued by warfare. And then I fell in love with a young Marine right before the surge. And it just upped the ante of like, okay, now you're here. You have this big job and
Yeah.
this, big thing that you're supposed to be doing, advising people on, strategic things with this war effort, while you're in love with somebody who's about to go possibly be in the tactical level of it. And it just kind of brought it home to me how important that job was and how I had to get it right. And over the next, I was there for about 2.5, 3 years. And I just wanted to change the way things were going. I could see us kind of veering off course of, say what you want. I have had a lot of people on the podcast who disliked the surge because we lost so many people during the surge. It was
Yeah.
horrifying, but that was in an effort to change kind of the course of the way things were going
Right.
in Afghanistan. And then, we gave up all that blood and treasure, and we started pulling back. So by the time I left NGIC in 2013, spring of 2013, that was when we were in negotiations with the Taliban. They had their Doha office, and um, it was so difficult. We were talking about what made it easy to leave that job at the time is everybody was talking about government cutbacks and how it was going to be, first come, first on the table, like axed. And so I was like, well, I'm super junior here. My job could go away. I might as well go get married to not the man that I was in love with, the Marine, but somebody
Mhm.
different. And, I might as well go do this, go be a mom, whatever. Um, and I was sitting there, and I'll never forget this. I've talked about this story multiple times on my podcast, but seeing the news that the Taliban had raised their flag at their office, their political negotiations office, and it was their sign that like they're not just the Taliban, they're a government in exile. And for me, that was the sign that like nothing I had done at NGIC had lasted.
Mm.
People were going to move forward towards this end state that was going to involve negotiating with the Taliban, and it was going to be a disaster, and it was a question of when. And I just had to let it go. I had to stop looking at what was happening in Afghanistan because it was going to make me crazy. And so from there, I wrote a book about kind of the surge era. And it was basically based on me realizing that, okay, here's the job you have. Now you love somebody who's in it, having skin in the game, and how that changes the way that we think
Mm.
about war. And I then had children, and children take away the time from the book writing effort. And
Oh, I
I
know. I
started,
know.
oh yeah, it's so hard because you're like, it's easy. I could write short pieces. And so that's what I started doing. I started writing opinion pieces, and that became my new life. And then the withdrawal happened, and it was like just this black hole, and it
Yeah.
sucked me in because there was so much devastation, so much need. And as soon as I
Yeah.
started writing about it, I just had Afghans just all over my social media. Hey, here's my story. Can you help me? And
Wow.
the only way I could help them was to try to tell their stories. And so here I am, and I've got, 50 to 100 people messaging me daily. And I'm
Wow.
trying to figure out, okay, well, you five have the same problem here, and these five have the same problem here. Here are some different pieces I can write where I'm highlighting what's going on in real time with the special immigrant visa program, or with starvation, or with World Food Program aid that was unsatisfactory. With Taliban stealing aid or not giving it out the way that they were supposed to, all these different things that nobody
Right.
was able to report on because the Taliban had quashed the media. I was able to because I had this link with people still in Afghanistan who we had
Hmm.
failed to get out. So from that point, I just kept writing and kept writing. And then I met Michael Cook, who happens to live in the same area that I do. And um, he said, you should start a podcast. And I said, no, you should start a podcast. And we both kind of laughed. And then we got together a couple weeks later, and I had a list of all the people that I thought we should talk to. And, I had talked to so many people when I was writing about
Hmm.
post withdrawal time that it was like, oh, here's 30 guests just, off of the top of my head that we can interview. And he's like, okay, we'll do this. And that's how
Yeah.
all of that led to the podcast.
Wow, what a journey. Yeah, I mean, look, we live in a time of unprecedented connectivity, and there are certainly people, there are governments that abuse that, but I think just as citizens, who care about our country and care about our allies, like we all have an obligation, if possible, to use our voice in a truthful way and to provide a platform for others to use their voice. So that's great.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I appreciate it.
so going back, like just a bit in time, like what first got you interested in Afghanistan? Because, I mean, you talked about kind of the academic interest starting out, but it seems like there's something much deeper that, connected you to the country. I mean, like, what's unique about the country to you?
There's a lot. I think it's just the vast complications, right, that go on in Afghanistan. There were ties for me. Um, there are so many different ethnic groups, for instance, and I had studied about the the former Yugoslavia, all of like, Serbia, Croatia, all of the ethnic conflict there, and I was so moved by that and what had happened, in the 90s
Hmm.
in those countries. And so there was that tie where, oh, there's a lot of ethnic conflict in Afghanistan, and it's an important, if you don't understand that, you'll never understand the country. And then it was like, oh, well, you also need to understand its historical past, and the
Right.
way that it just layers on layers of complicated things that you had to comprehend. And under it, it was just, it's one of those things that I can't really explain. It's like a God moment, like where I can't tell you why. Something happened, whether you call it the universe or God or what have you. Like I can't
It's a
rightly
calling.
say.
It's a
Yeah.
calling.
And I think
Yeah.
that's it. And I would love to be able to say like, oh, it's the people, but I didn't get to go meet the people because I didn't go there. Although I did meet amazing people here and there, like my friend's father's interpreter who hosted all of my classmates at a dinner in his tiny
Nice.
Alexandria apartment where he had escaped the Taliban. They had a death warrant
Oh,
out for him, and
well.
they pulled him out, and he was lovely. But even then I couldn't really converse with him super well. There were lots of us there, but it was such a kind gesture. And for a man who was struggling as a taxi driver trying to get his doctor, be able to practice medicine in the US. He was a doctor in Afghanistan, and for him to do
Hmm.
that for us was just so generous. And it's something that I've found with every Afghan that I've talked with. But that
Yeah.
wasn't it. It was just this, it's like there were problems and somebody needed to come help, and I just wanted to
Yeah.
understand and help. And I was talking to Bill Raggio and Will Selber the other day, and we were all just so for the podcast, we were so down on all the things that were happening and so angry. But then in the
Yeah.
end, we all remembered, like, it's the hope that we have. You just have hope for this insane problem set that seems unresolvable. And somehow you just come up with the hope. And so, yeah, something drew me to it. And the ability to maybe make a positive change despite all of those horrible things all going on at the same time was really a big draw, probably.
Yeah, look, the conflict in Afghanistan, it's too complex for one person to solve it, right? And so even though, the challenges right now seem insurmountable, just joining forces with others, as a community tackling the same issue, that can have a real impact, in the long term, even if we don't see that right away.
I definitely think so, and it's neat. I see
Yeah.
it especially when, the people who banded together during the withdrawal, all the different individuals who were like, "Hey, I can do this, I can do that." Most of them have gone on, or many of them have gone on to start their own groups and taking those
Mhm.
skills and applying them to some niche aspect of what has happened post withdrawal. And it's just beautiful to see that. And it's hard. I see the impact it has on each of them. It's not easy, but they continue to do it. And it gives me some faith in humanity. It's that, I don't know if it's a proverb or if it's or where it comes from, but the Jewish belief that if you change one life, you change the world. It's kind of like that. And I see that in so many of these people. And I love that about the group that is still focused on Afghanistan today. They're not going to give
Yeah.
up, and they really are making a huge impact.
Yeah, so the proverb, as a religious Jew, right, I could say, it's actually if you save a life,
Yeah.
you've saved a world. And it's interesting because a few months ago when I was talking to Legend, who's a religious Muslim, he told me it was a Muslim quote, and I was like, "Oh wow. Okay, so I don't know exactly where it is in their scriptures, but you know, that's okay if we borrow a little bit of wisdom from each other. But I thought that was really cool. And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of veterans, whether you're religious or not, I think, they really relate to that and want to be part of the continuing mission. So leading up to the US withdrawal from Afghanistan in the summer of 2021, what were some of the warning signs that the withdrawal would lead to chaos? In your opinion, how could it have been handled differently? So it's a two-part question,
Ah,
right?
oh, well, it's a just that's a huge one, right? Like, I
Mhm.
mean, people have studied it, but groups of people much smarter than me have sat down to study that. And I feel like every one of them is motivated politically in some way or another,
Mm,
right? So, what I would say is go back to the Doha agreement, and
mhm,
that was horrendous. The, the fact that we didn't negotiate with the Afghan government basically said, you guys just take a back seat. This is between us and the Taliban, which basically set up the power structure that was going to
mhm,
happen. And we can say all we want that we didn't think the Taliban was going to take control of that quickly. Well, why didn't you involve the Afghan government that you wanted to take control in your negotiations? A lot of
yeah,
aspects of the Doha agreement itself are completely they don't make any sense. The fact that we said, yeah, you need to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners. And we knew just about, how the Taliban was doing in terms of the space they controlled at that point.
mhm,
What did we think was going to happen when 5,000 Taliban prisoners were released? And I think the Afghan government said that they would release 1,500 of them. But then we saw, the prisons got let out, and everybody got out anyway. And that's what happens. I was
yeah.
talking to Pashtana Durrani, and she has a great book out. But she was in the book, she talks about how,
Who is
the
she?
prisons always get, she is an amazing young Afghan woman. She was raised in Pakistan. Her father was a tribal leader, and she has an education group. They basically are using these tablets that are solar
Mhm.
chargeable, very durable to teach girls wherever they are. So if they couldn't, it
Oh, wow.
started with the idea that in Kandahar, you couldn't go to a school because the Taliban were blowing them up as fast as the Afghan government could create them. And there were, there are a lot of tribal individuals down there who don't really want to educate their girls. And so Pashtana was able, with the cachet that she had as the tribal leader's daughter,
Hmm.
and with just she studied religion and all these things to kind of explain why why they needed education. And she was able to start this nonprofit. She still continues with it, but in her book she talks about how you always know basically that things are changing over when the prisons get,
Mhm.
prisoners get released. And when that
Yeah.
happens, it's like there's no putting that genie back in the bottle. So those the DOA was, honestly, it goes back further though, because people, when you say DOA, everybody is going to expect that whatever I'm saying here will give away my
Well, by
political
the way,
beliefs,
just for
right?
context, for anyone who
Yeah,
doesn't know, the agreement took place in 2020, right? So
right.
this was approximately a year before the withdrawal. Yeah.
Right. And it was negotiated by Trump and Trump's pick,
Right.
who Afghans absolutely loathe and despise.
Yeah.
So if you say it's the problem started in Doha, people say, well,
Mhm.
you're just, a Democrat who hates Trump. If you say that the problems happened during the withdrawal, then you are, somebody who's hating on Biden. Let me just say, I
Yeah.
politically don't have a home after Afghanistan fell apart. I've lost my political home. None of this is due to any specific person. It is not political. It is
Mhm.
a long standing, let's go back to 2013 when I was standing in my kitchen watching the Taliban raise their flag at their office. We wanted out of Afghanistan. And I think at some point we just said, it's going to be bad, just like I did. It's going to be bad. Let's try to make it as least bad as possible. And we just made a series of horrible decisions to get to that outcome. So Doha was bad. I'd love to, I want to give mad props to Bill Raggio at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, because
Mhm.
he was putting out these amazing maps that showed the space that the Taliban controlled. And he'd been doing it for some time, just assiduously combing through all these reports to figure out, who had what. And as the withdrawal grew closer, there were American people saying, no, 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 Bill Raggio has it wrong. And in the end, Bill Raggio was 100% right. He got it right. The Taliban had all this space, all this momentum. And if we had really wanted to understand what was coming, we could have focused on those kinds of details and not these very sunny perspectives about what was going to happen. um, I've had a lot of interesting people come on and talk about Bagram Air Force Base.
Mhm.
We abandoned Bath in the middle of the night. We didn't tell the Afghans who worked there that we were going to do it. For me, that was such a bad move. As soon as I heard it, I thought, why would you stick with us? Why would you stick with the Americans if that's what they do?
What was
Right.
the reasoning for the Americans to do that?
So interestingly, I've heard a couple different stories. One individual said that there were actually some kind of weaponry systems set up around Bath that would have caused more harm to Americans trying to exfiltrate Afghanistan than if they did it through HKIA, Hamid Karzai International Airport. So that was one
Hmm.
explanation. Uh, Somebody else had another good one that was kind of like the similar bent, where like it's actually going to be worse from Bath. I still struggle to believe that Bath wasn't in the middle of Kabul. It wasn't, we couldn't even do all of the security ourselves. The Taliban were pulling security at HKIA, which when I first heard that, I thought that has to be a lie. Tell me that's a lie, but it
Mhm.
wasn't. And they were killing people who we were trying to save as they let some people through and just murdered people, pulling security details. So the other thing, and this has been the problem, I think, that I have seen myself dating back to my career for the US government, we have always failed we've always underestimated the Taliban.
Mhm.
So we didn't realize how great their will to fight was. We never realized it was always that, the Americans have the watches, the Taliban have the time.
Yeah.
And if we really thought that they were just going to bend over and say, here, yeah, Afghan government, let's do a power sharing agreement, that was never going to happen. It was just
No.
never going to happen. So, if we really believed that anything other than what occurred was going to occur, we were deluding ourselves because we wanted out and we just were done. We were wiping our hands clean of Afghanistan. And unfortunately, we ended the war for ourselves, but we did not end the war for all the people that we left behind, not just our allies, but just Afghans who now have to live under Taliban rule.
Right. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's very heavy. It's a lot to take in, the tragedy of it. So you touched upon the Doha agreement. So let's talk about that for a moment. Um, so before Ayman al-Zawahiri's death in a U.S. drone strike in 2022, he had a presence in Kabul, suggesting that Al-Qaeda leadership viewed Afghanistan as a preferred location for its political nerve center, right? So in an intelligence assessment earlier that year, it was clear that the Taliban was leveraging their relationship with Al-Qaeda's senior leadership despite their stated commitments in the 2020 U.S. Taliban Doha agreement, in which they agreed cynically, right, to refrain from allowing international jihadists to operate on Afghan soil. So today, as we're speaking, there are over a dozen, I think over 20 of these groups that are operating on Afghan soil. So, as a former intel analyst, why do you think Afghanistan is seen as an ideal haven for these various terrorist organizations?
I think that it's a permissive environment.
Mhm.
There are already camps that have been there. I just had so Bill Raggio once again, because man, that man is just prolific, and his understanding of the Taliban is beat by no one. And it's all open source stuff that he deals with. So he is my idol. But he recently released something in the Long War Journal where he talked about Saif al-Adil, who is now the emir of Al Qaeda, or the senior leader of Al Qaeda, and he, in an Al Qaeda publication, called all of those who want to take part in jihad to come to Afghanistan, and he
Mhm.
called it a model government. And this has been something I've watched. The Taliban have set up this government that is very much based on local level dispute resolution
Mhm.
from religious individuals. No, no democracy, no Western style. No, that's not allowed. In fact, among the most persecuted and endangered people in Afghanistan now are the legal professionals from the old times, because they don't. There is
Mhm.
that's not law in their minds. So it's this place where the Taliban have created this order that they see as religiously pure, and anybody who agrees with them is free to operate in that environment. So what Bill Raggio said in my recent podcast with him, he talked about how the UN has assessed that there are 10 Al Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan right now. There is a weapons depot up in Panjshir. There are 5 madrasas or madaris, depending on if you're using Arabic or not. They've got ties with the Turkestan Islamic Party, with the TTP, with all these groups, right? And then you have ISKP, the Islamic State Khorasan province, that are going out and doing all these high profile attacks on Westerners, um, or Chinese, anybody who is not from the area,
Well, the
Chinese business people.
Chinese have certainly taken advantage. Starting on September 2nd
Mhm.
of 2021, they've certainly taken advantage of the power vacuum, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And I've heard many individuals just in, passing observations to me on social media talking about seeing Chinese people on former American bases trying to exploit whatever we left behind, training people in radio use. They're definitely trying to, and they've increased oil production in Afghanistan through their oil resources. They're all over the place, but ISKP has targeted them. They don't like that. They don't like Westerners who are traveling in the area. There's just a lot of lawlessness, right? And to me, that's the draw of Afghanistan. There's lawlessness. And then now we have Al Qaeda senior leaders literally saying, come here and learn how to do jihad so you can go be a sleeper cell in the
Hmm.
West, which to me, that's remarkably concerning. And yet there are only a handful of people who seem to care. And it just harkens back to 9/11 when when 9/11 happened and we all said, well, why didn't anyone warn us? And I don't want that to happen again, where it's, why didn't
There were
anyone
people
warn
who warned
us?
us. Ahmad Massoud warned us.
Oh yeah,
There
and
were
he died,
voices.
right?
Yeah.
So it's, and I hear it from legend, legend says bad things are coming. Will Selber, retired USAF lieutenant colonel, has been all over the place on the Bulwark and other places saying, hey, look, this is coming for us. In fact, Bill mentioned, and I hadn't been tracking this, but apparently there were like 8 Islamic State individuals who were arrested in New York, Los Angeles, and somewhere else here in this
Yeah.
country, who came in through the border.
Right.
So we are not being vigilant. This Afghanistan is absolutely a haven for anyone who wants to get their jihad on. They can go get trained there, they can go get educated there, and they can then be working with all these different groups with different capabilities. The question is, do they have the capability to attack us? And I think
Right.
that might be the thing that keeps uh media and other groups from really getting too worked up now, because from everything I've seen, they don't have that capability. I don't know how that assessment is made, and I definitely want to look more into it because it is startling and we should be concerned. We left a power vacuum. That Taliban have not agreed to that part of the Doha, or have not, done what they said they would do in that part of the Doha agreement, and yet we give them scads of money. They have taken in, I meant to put the numbers out, but if you ever read the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR, they put out the most comprehensive information about US support to Afghanistan in the aftermath of the withdrawal.
Hmm.
And they recently calculated the amount of aid that we've given to the Taliban and the amount of that aid that has been siphoned off just through customs
Hmm.
payments, because we have to pay customs, we have to pay tax, all that stuff. All that aid money gets put through those things. And so it was somewhere in the tens of millions of dollars from that aid that has just gone to line Taliban, pockets. That doesn't include all of the coercion that's going on when the aid comes in. And that cigar mentions that too, that these aid groups are being told, well, hey, you got to put some money here. We need something here. There is a transactional price basically for doing business in
Not to mention
Afghanistan,
the
and that we
interest,
should.
right? Some of this money that could be sitting in bank accounts,
Oh,
right?
sure.
The interest generated from such a large sum of money, that alone could be used for some very dangerous activities by these terrorist groups.
Sure. I didn't even think
Yeah.
about that. That's
Hmm.
absolutely true. When you've got that much money, you're definitely making some money on that. So it's uh it's really concerning. I'm hoping that there are some individuals in government who are really watching this closely. I know that I have one friend who does this work, and she's always talking to handlers in the agency, and they just don't seem to care about the information that she has. And
Hmm.
I don't deal with that. I was never part of that world exactly, so I don't know how that goes, but nothing that I'm hearing makes me feel good right now.
Well, thank you for being honest, even if the truth hurts, right? Um, on the topic of recruitment, what do you think is the appeal of the Taliban to those who join?
Well, there's a lot. So there's food and money. I've
Mhm.
heard tell that they are using aid, especially in the beginning, right? When the World Food Program was bringing in aid, the Taliban would say, "Well, we'll distribute it," and it would go to their friends and family. It wouldn't go to the widowed family, the widowed wife who can't go work. So access to scarce resources is a big one. You also then get to be in the place to exert control rather than to have control exerted upon you, which I think is a draw when you're living in a place where people are getting stoned to death for violating rules, which no one really knows what those are, or you're put in jail for arbitrary reasons. The ability to be on the oppressor side rather than the oppressed is a big draw. Um, and I think that the Taliban are very quickly shifting opinions in Afghanistan. So I saw some interesting reporting a while back about particularly women's issues where, um, the wearing the veil. So back in the day, wearing the veil was something that a lot of women in the South did traditionally. That was something that was expected, or,
We're
it
talking
was
about
done
full
there.
full
Right. The
facial
full,
cover.
full cover. So like, the images we all see of Afghan women in like the light purple periwinkle colored burqa. Um, that was a norm there, but it wasn't a norm everywhere. Women
Hmm.
in Kabul would just kind of wear a loose hijab and be good to go and wear, modest clothing. Um, but they weren't covering themselves fully. And so now we're seeing, oh, well, you have to be covered fully. And they're making it incumbent upon men to enforce that, right? If you don't do it, we're going to take it out on men, the men of your family. They're
Mm.
going to get called to the Taliban office. They're going to do whatever. And so I think slowly they are, if you don't comply, you are ostracized, you're put in jail, what have you. And so they're kind of, eh, people are starting to just do what they say. And so we've got
Mm.
men who previously
Right.
would have said, yeah, I want women to be educated. And now they're saying, no, it's all good. We're going to keep our women home and that's fine. And so you're slowly seeing this shift in mindset that it might not be real. It might not be something long standing and permanent, but as long
It's
as the Taliban are
coerced.
in power, right, that's the way it is. And so I think the appeal is not dying. I've seen horrifying things since I have been covering
Yeah.
this issue. Recently, um, what recently made its way through X was a teenage boy who called a girl on the phone. That was his crime. The local Taliban commander took him and inserted a wooden dowel into his anus and beat it into him. And there is
Mm.
video of that online. And I couldn't watch it. I was just sickened. That's the crime. He called a girl. The other thing you could see in that video is that he had clearly been beaten. There were purple stripes all across his bare legs, and that's what the Taliban will do too. They'll beat you so badly that you die from like internal bleeding and you just can't survive it. And so I see these images of, former Afghan military personnel that we promised you fight with us and we'll protect you. And they're left for dead on a doorstep, or they have their skin stripped off their body, or just heinous things. Their Human Rights Watch did a whole report on a culvert that they found, like, I want to say 70, but I don't quote me, bodies in pieces in that culvert. It's my
Yeah.
friend Leslie Merriman has, with her sources on the ground, found multiple mass graves and notified the ICC that they exist because,
Yeah.
what else can she do? She can't go there. Nobody can go there to look at these things
Yeah.
right now and see what's happening. So, yeah, I think that the main appeal is access to resources and the fact that you get to be the oppressor and have less of a chance of being murdered.
Yeah. Yeah. That's stuff that's really hard to stomach. Stuff that I think most Americans can't imagine, can't relate to. But
Mhm.
that is the reality there. People are coerced and they're just trying to survive. So
Absolutely.
yeah. So finishing up, so what kind of future could there be for democracy in Afghanistan? I kind of hesitate, honestly, to even use the term democracy. Like what does that even mean anymore? And is that even the right, system for Afghanistan?
Mhm.
But let's say, what kind of future could there be? I'm just rephrasing the question, actually. What kind of future could there be for, an improved society where there is security, where there is a basic standard of human rights, which I mean, it's beyond the pale, right? What you've been telling me. What kind of future could there be for that kind of secure, prosperous society in Afghanistan? And included in that future, what kind of rebuilding would need to be undertaken to fix the impact of the Taliban's anti-women policies in particular?
Well, I think I mentioned the societal kind of shift away from women's rights under the Taliban. That's going to be a big problem. I talked to Manisha Bakhtari, who is the ambassador to, I can't remember the country exactly, but she's still acting as the Afghan
Mhm.
ambassador. She refuses to give up her role, and she told me that it's going to be generations for women now. And you would think, oh, it's only been 3 years, but from just the loss of education, loss of ability to work, the stress that they've been under, all of those things, it's going to be a large digging out process to kind of bring standards up for women and bring the
Mhm.
social I mean, think about it. It took us 20 years to lower maternal mortality rates that were horrifying under the Taliban's first role, and to kind of bring women into government and make education normal in most parts of Afghanistan, but not
Mhm.
all. Like I mentioned, Pashtana Durrani and her efforts to bring education to the South, where the perceptions of women are massively different. And so you're dealing with Afghanistan, all these different cultural pieces, different groups who value women differently. Um, that's going to be a task for democracy, or just a future that isn't Taliban run.
Yeah.
I think that what has to happen is, and I've said this multiple times, Afghans have to unify. Because here's the problem: is for the last 20 years, we've been putting American solutions on Afghans. Oh, here's
Mhm.
a government that we think you should do. Here's the military we think you should have. And if you talk to any people who actually care about Afghanistan and have studied it, they'll say, no. And people much smarter than myself, who really focus in on those small areas and just have a wealth of expertise. The things that we've put in have been wrong, and there are better things we could have done. And so the real future has to be Afghans who don't want the Taliban standing up and saying, let's do this thing. Basically, I have loved Legend came on my podcast, and he
Mhm.
said something that just stuck with me, and I wish I had the actual quote, but basically it was, um you guys fought your revolution in the US, and you wanted your path forward. And now you're just telling us to sit down and shut up. And that's the thing. Afghans have to have their
Patrick Henry.
revolution.
I think he
Yeah.
was quoting Patrick
Was
Henry.
he? Yeah. Oh,
Yeah, Legend knows more about American history than 99% of Americans do.
a
I'll give him
100% he
I'll give him
does.
some credit there.
He does. He is someone who needs to be at the forefront of those talks. And people have to, there are so many different groups, right? There are many different Afghan resistance groups to the Taliban, many efforts to create a government in exile. And those need to be Afghan led, and people have to put aside their differences. This is a country that
Mhm.
has so many different ethnic groups, so many different long standing grievances. And it seems like just generational trauma of, well, you killed my ancestors, now I'm in power, I'm going to
Right.
kill, all this stuff. It has to be dealt with almost like
Yeah.
an ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal of Yugoslavia, right? They tried to go in and say, okay, let's redress all these grievances. There needs to be a tribunal in Afghanistan to redress grievances and find a way for Afghans to lead moving forward, and to drop all of that, anything that doesn't create progress, right? It's seemingly insurmountable, but then, and I want to bring up Pashtana Durrani again, because there was no one, there had never been a female leader of her tribe. And when her father died, her uncle, I think, just kind of took on the leadership role. And the locals were like, no, we don't want him. We want Pashtana. This is
Mm.
a massively, patriarchal group, and they chose a woman. And that gives me hope. If somebody can do that, and then, just those small things make a difference. That wasn't imposed by a Western government. That was
Mm.
chosen by Afghans because she made an impact. She learned and figured out, okay, here's how I can change your mind. Here's how we can all work together for the betterment of our country. And it's going to take a lot of Pashtana Duranis. Not one person can do it. It's like you said in the beginning, not one person will save Afghanistan. It has to be a lot of Afghans saying, we want this more than, you know, anything else.
Wow. Well, Beth, thank you so much for coming on, for educating me and for educating others. And yeah, I'm wishing alongside you that we are going to see a much better, peaceful, prosperous Afghanistan in the future. And yeah, we have to stick together and keep using our voices. So thank you for coming on.